Good morning, everybody. As the CEO of the Victorian Applied Learning, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this year's Vala annual conference, where we celebrate 20 years of applied learning in Victoria. But before we proceed, Vala acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we meet today throughout Victoria. I'm on the currently very misty lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in the Yarra Valley. We pay our respect to the elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, the tradition, the cultures and hopes of Aboriginal Australia. We extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people present today. Furthermore, in a time where a growing us versus them mentality is ever more creating a dispirited us versus them mentality is ever more creating a dispirited society in which hate speech becomes normalized, we welcome each and every one of you. No matter your cultural background, religious beliefs, sexual orientation, gender identification, physical or mental ability, age or gender, we offer all of you our unconditional positive regard. Vala is a safe space for everybody. Today, we would like to extend a special welcome to our keynote speakers, Mr. Trent McCarthy, Chair of the 31 Victorian Local Learning and Employment Networks, and Professor Damien Blake, Head of the School of Education at Deakin University. We also extend this welcome to Ms. Susan Bell, Executive Director of the Senior Secondary Certificate Reform Group and her team within the VCAA, as well as Dr. Cornelia de Brincat, VCAA VCAL Unit Manager. We acknowledge and greatly appreciate the ongoing support, both professionally and financially, we receive from the VCAA to put on our conferences. We also look forward to continuing our collaboration with both the VCAA and the Department of Education throughout the Senior Secondary Certificate Reform process, and we welcome our invitation to a seat at the Senior Secondary Certificate Reform, it's a mouthful, to the reference group. We welcome you as participants. The breadth of I can't see my slides, sorry, I missed the slide. We welcome you as participants, the breadth of your diverse backgrounds, spanning educators from all sectors, local learning and employment networks, and Head Start clusters from across Victoria, the Department of Education and VCAA and other parties are testament to the breadth of support and dedication for applied learning in Victoria. To all the passionate educators across the state, we commend you for your dedication and persistence in creating outstanding programs and projects within the VCAL. Be it drawing on your own personal or social networks with support from your local LEN or professional development through Vala and tertiary institution, you utilize whatever it takes to create valuable learning opportunities for your students. You go beyond the school gates. You take risks, you act now, and if need be, ask for forgiveness later. For you, it's not the system, it's not the model, but it is the student that is at the core of your practice. For 20 years, the flexibility of the VCAL has enabled highly successful outcomes for our young people, each with their own aspirations, needs, and abilities. We want to make sure that in the next 20 years, the students remain at the center of our education, regardless of the system or the model that the VCAL transitions into. We will continue with the support of our members and stakeholders to advocate for this, to ensure that no young person is left behind. We also thank our presenters for their generosity, their time to share their skills, knowledge, and above all, their passion for applied learning. We today are sharing gold nuggets that we want to keep hold of and carry forward into the next 20 years. We thank our moderators, and we've got a group of students from, multi students from Deakin University that have volunteered their time, as well as Rebecca Absalon from High Resolves and Amanda Templeton. There is a time of change that we live in, and the world is turned upside down. But one thing, there's also a bit of change happening at Vala at the moment, and you might have seen the funny thing that Don put on his email on Wednesday, when initially the emails were he was going from his desk on the left, and on Thursday he said he's tidied up his desk and it now looks like this. I do want to make note and acknowledge the work that Don has done for us for the last well over a decade, and I need to let you know with a slight sadness that Don is retiring. I had hoped that today was going to be a face-to-face farewell for Don's last major event that he's helped us administrate. Don has been the cornerstone of Vala for so many years, and I would really like you to maybe do a shout out to Don as well, and thank him for his support, because anybody that's been to any Vala event in the last 12 or maybe more than 12 years will have met Don, and we greatly appreciate his vast contribution, and we'll dearly miss him, but wish him very well and all the best in retirement, and I'll keep bugging him anyway. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Trent McCarthy from the Chair of the Victorian Local Learning and Employment Networks and Chief Executive of Central Ranges Local Learning and Employment Network. Alongside these roles, Trent has served as a councillor at Darebin in Melbourne's North since 2008. He's also worked as a strategist, facilitator and speaker with a special focus on helping young people create meaningful change. Trent also enjoyed a 10-year stint in the Melbourne Comedy Festival, including touring intercultural comedy shows to schools and communities throughout regional Victoria. He is co-founder of the White Lion Bailout, which raised over $8 million in support of our young people in detention and at risk. A third-generation game show winner, apparently that's a thing, Trent feels very lucky to work with Victoria's 31 Lens as they celebrate 20 years of making the outcomes for young people everyone's business. Please welcome Trent.
Thank you, Helene, and thank you, and hello, welcome to everyone, and what a joy it is to be joining you all. Before I get into my talk, I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I'm on today, and also the lands that you're all joining us from today. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and also pay respects to the traditional owners and elders of the communities that you're all joining us from today, and acknowledge that the work that we do as educators, as brokers of change, and as people who are genuinely concerned about education and community is often in strong and close solidarity with Aboriginal people and also Aboriginal young people in particular. So I'm really overjoyed to be with you today. It's obviously a chance to celebrate 20 years of applied learning and the wonderful work that I know so many of you do, and so many have done before us as well. I'm the chair of the 31 Local Learning and Employment Networks. We refer to ourselves as the Victorian Lens, and we love acronyms, Vala, Lens, VCAL, and what's really important though is how we get beyond the acronyms to what the core of our work is all about, and what unites us and what drives us to continue to do better. So the title of my talk is Positive Disruption, and I've borrowed this term from a dear friend and a mentor and one of the founders of the Lens, Howard Kelly. Howard Kelly was the project director of the Kirby Review and had a long and distinguished career in education, working in tech schools, in government schools, and in really interesting and robust environments before he found his way into the departmental bureaucracy to be the project director for the Kirby Review. And the Kirby Review, as some of you would know, really was the cornerstone of reform in 2000, 2001. And the term positive disruption is a term that I've heard Howard use on a number of occasions, because the way that he thinks about and describes the work of both the Lens and of applied learning educators, VCAL teachers, VCAL coordinators, and even some principals and people within the bureaucracy, is that we have to be constantly positively disrupting the mainstream. And it's a really interesting idea, because a lot of what we see through any reform process is actually an attempt to consolidate, to firm up, to lock things down, and to finalise things. And yet the story of the last 20 years, and particularly the basis of both VCAL and also the lens, which have at their core the same foundation, is this notion that those who are disruptive in the classroom deserve more. Those who are disruptive in the school grounds need more. And those who aren't necessarily disruptive but can disrupt the economy deserve the best chance to try things out, to make a difference, and to be their best self. My background, as Helene mentioned, involves working with young people and organisations in the juvenile justice system, as well as through applied learning contexts, including in adult education. And one of the things that I've always found as a fascinating element is that this notion that we need to, and this is another Howard Kelly term, make good trouble. So the idea that someone who doesn't fit in, someone who is looking for more, is given an opportunity to express themselves and to try things out, is for me at the core of what we're all about, which is giving every young person the best chance they can to thrive and succeed. So we're celebrating this year 20 years of putting young people at the centre through applied learning and place-based partnerships. And that for us is something that we share and are very pleased to share this celebration this year with Vala and Helene and her whole team, and of course all of you who are part of a very strong community across the state. And I thought it might be useful for us to travel back in time to actually understand the basis of where we have been and what we are celebrating, which also helps, I think, set the basis of where we are going and where we need to go, and the challenge that's before all of us. So traveling back in time, I'm not sure how many of you have ever read a ministerial review or a parliamentary report, but for me this is essential reading, and this is the Ministerial Review of Post-Compulsory Education and Training Pathways in Victoria, otherwise known as the Kirby Report. And the Kirby Report really laid the foundation for applied learning and for place-based partnerships, which is what the Lens have had a strong focus on for 20 years. And it really validated those two things and said that these things are absolutely essential to the future of the education system and the training system in Victoria. But what's interesting is that the basis of this report, and this report was under the Bracks government, and obviously Minister Koski, the late Minister Koski, was the absolute driver in relation to this work, was this notion that we needed a broader commitment of government, community and industry to really support young people and their future pathways, and that there was the forces of globalisation really marching at a much quicker pace, but also that there were challenges in our own economy and our own opportunity for young people, and that there were young people who were slipping through the cracks. And those of you that were in the education system, were teachers or involved in other ways at this time, may remember that this was a period of significant reform, but also significant opportunity. So I wanted to, and I don't expect you to read all this, but these slides will be available. But what I wanted to really bring to our attention is the fact that the questions that are before us at the moment, the questions that we're grappling with the Firth Review, the reform of senior secondary pathways, and also the Macklin Review, which is looking at the training system and the education system more generally, is that the same questions that we're grappling with now are the same questions we were grappling with 20 years ago and even 20 years before then. At the core, the reforms 20 years ago were acknowledging that different types of learners need different sorts of things, that communities and industries are critical to supporting young people and their schools to make their way through a rapidly changing world. And with economic and social change happening both across the globe 20 years ago and even now again today, those communities of interest, those whole of community responses, are absolutely essential for young people's wellbeing as well as their pathways. So the other thing that's probably critical to highlight when it came to the Kirby reforms was this notion that there was already great work happening. This was not the basis of that government said, let's do something different, let's do something new. There were amazing things happening, and many of you I know would have been involved in those things, those local partnerships between community, industry and school to support young people, those applied learning programs that popped up not because government said, we need to have this, but because a community or a school or educator said, we need this for our kids. And so the Kirby reforms really built on the grassroots work that had taken place for many years. I myself came from a senior secondary school, Swinburne Senior Secondary College, which was a year 11 and 12 school that was all about applied learning and was a place to capture students that were not fitting into the mainstream. And what's interesting is that if we look at any education setting, there were the seeds of VCAL and applied learning in so many different contexts in Melbourne and across the state. There's obviously also the critical reflection that there were the partnerships that were taking place already were a recognition that people wanted to make a difference in the lives of young people, that with the decline of manufacturing and the loss of jobs across the sector, there was an opportunity here to do something different and to build new pathways for young people in new and emerging jobs. And so that really sat at the core of these reforms. And this is, for me, is a really interesting piece of research. This was from a paper that was produced just after the Kirby reforms were adopted. And effectively, it drew together both the lens and also VCAL as two critical reforms that would set up Victoria's future and young people's future in Victoria. Why I wanted to highlight this particular piece of research is that what it also did is that it raised the question about how we fund these things and the importance of parity when it came to ensuring that applied learning was valued from both a government investment point of view, but also from a community involvement point of view, alongside VCE and alongside traditional mainstream education. And this notion of parity and this notion that applied learning is valid, it is something which must be embraced, it is something which is absolutely essential to our future, is for me the critical question that we have before us right now as we start to go into a new phase of reform with the Firth Review and the Firth reforms. This notion of applied learning, whether it's to support the needs of students to go into industries, or whether it's to support those young people who have not been disconnected, but education has not connected with them in a traditional sense, and they need something different. That's not the fault of a young person. That is actually the fault of the system, having not adapted and flexed to the needs of those young people. So these reforms that we see right now are in many ways the next chapter, or could be the next chapter in the work that Kirby did 20 years ago. At the critical point though, the question that is before all of us and before us 20 years ago and 20 years before that and today is this question that is in the minds of so many of us, which is that we just want to give this kid a go. We just want to give this young person the best chance to be themselves and to thrive in a rapidly changing world. And for me, that's what the core work of LENS are. LENS are local learning and employment networks. We're effectively the collaboration of individuals, of organisations, of businesses and communities, of educators, of people who care about young people and their future and believe with complete passion and conviction that the outcomes for young people are everyone's business. And how we make that happen and how we continue to make that happen is for us a constant source of challenge. So I asked myself this question: what does LEN work look like today compared to 20 years ago? 20 years ago, we were holding think tanks, summits, doing reports, having lots of meetings. We love meetings, but we're also building on programs that existed or had found their foundation somewhere. In my own LEN, which is in the Central Ranges area, which is not really a geographic area as such, it's more a place where there's a weather system, the Central Ranges, you might hear about on the weather reports. And it's also, of course, something in Lenland. So it is the Macedon Ranges, Mitchell and Murrindindi. In my area, we had to tackle this question a number of years ago, back in 2017, and we conceived of a program which effectively was all about trying to keep students engaged at year 10 and so that they could actually make their way into VCAL. We were finding that the rate of students dropping out of the system, disengaging from education at 2 of our schools was increasing, and we didn't see this as necessarily the fault of the school or students or anyone. It was no one's fault. What it was, though, was an opportunity to do something different. And in some respects, we just built on the work that so many applied learning educators who come before us had done. And so we talked about the importance of hands-on learning, of work readiness, of personal development, of putting the young person at the centre and recognising that if what they were doing outside of school was holding a spray can in their hand and engaging in some sort of unofficial public art, that we needed to go to where they were, and that we needed to build programs that valued who they were, what they were interested in, and positively disrupted the school and the education system to give them a chance to fit in, or rather to get the system to fit around them. And for us, that's been a core element of our work. The reason why I mention this is because for me, this is absolutely essential to the work that is before us. One thing that we've learned over the last few years running this program, and this is one of those examples of where a program started with 2 schools as a pilot, and now a few years later is a vocational education and training program aligned to a Certificate 2 in active volunteering. It's run for over 200 students across Victoria. It's run in 20 schools in partnership with 7 LENs, and meets the needs of students in inclusive education, students who are disengaged or disconnected, students who are just looking for something that's a bit more applied, a bit more real world, or that enables them to form a relationship back with their school. And for us, this is really a critical point, because one of the questions that we are now asking is, how do we ensure that the good things that we do, good programs like this and so many other things just like it across the state, the wonderful programs that engage young parents, how do we ensure that those things continue and remain strong as we go through these new reforms? How do we ensure that those things that we love, that we value, and we know work, actually continue to make a difference in the lives of young people? The fact that we do have students, that we do have young people who have thrived in applied learning and applied education is, I think, the strongest evidence that what you do is so critical, not just to the lives of these young people, but to society as a whole. For every young person who has the opportunity to access applied learning, who's supported by a place-based partnership that sees industry, community, educators and others come together and wrap themselves around that young person. Every time we do that, we are actually making a difference to our entire society, because we are enabling a young person to get through those difficult stages of adolescence, to transition to adulthood, and hopefully to be the person that they are always meant to be. So for me, this is the critical question. I think for the LENs, this is the question that we are constantly asking ourselves and asking government. How do we ensure that the things that are so important, those models of communities and partnerships around young people, continue regardless of what the curriculums are called, regardless of what the pathway is described as, regardless of whether it's called VCE, vocational, or VCAL, or whatever it might be, that those things that continue are privileged, are prioritised, and are properly funded. And for us, that is a critical question going forward. So I throw down, I suppose, the challenge, and I just wanted to show some of the wonderful images of what that looks like for us. I throw down the challenge: how do we ensure that these things, we continue to see these sorts of things happening in our schools and in our communities across the state over the next decade and beyond? The opportunity for students who don't feel that they fit to find a place, the opportunity for communities and industry to be positively disruptive in the classroom, in the education system, and with schools together in partnership, is absolutely the critical question that we all face. Diverse young people who already face significant barriers to employment and education, how do we ensure that their needs are met and that they're not put in the corner? My LEN operates out of a building that was once the VCAL Centre, and at the time, the VCAL Centre was basically a place where the students that were a bit disruptive were put in a program, and it was not given the priority that it was. I'm pleased to say that model has shifted and models change, and VCAL is absolutely a priority in that school now. And for me, that's a recognition that these things, good things, can get better. Hard things can be improved. But what is absolutely essential is that we continue to talk about keeping young people at the centre. We know, and I think this is the work that you all do, we know that when young people are given the skills, the tools and the opportunities, they can do amazing things. And the critical question that I would like to leave you with, and I, in fact, would also ask you to keep putting to not just to LENs and to businesses and industry, and also to our political leaders, because they need to hear this from us, is how do we make sure that we continue to keep that focus on applied learning, on place-based partnerships, build on the strengths that we have, build on the great work that's happened. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. but rather build on the incredible foundation that doesn't just go back 20 years. In fact, it goes back much longer, and creates that positive disruption, an education system that continually allows for positive disruption and allows us all to make good travel going into the future. Thanks very much. I'll end it there.
Thank you so much, Trent. And for those who know me, Trent, are you gone now? There you are. Yeah, the LENs have been an absolute key support to applied learning, and I know lots of LENs have got applied learning networks or VCAL networks that they run at a local level where they build really good communities of practice. They also currently, and they've gone through a lot of different contracts over the years. I congratulate the LENs as well on their 20 years. You are actually in 20 years. We are, no, you've done 20 years. We are in the 20th year, or VCAL is. Vala is in its 16th year as a response to the need of VCAL teachers and providers. I've asked for some questions in the QA, but nothing has come up, and I think maybe people are just going, well, that's spot on, and that is spot on, Trent. This amazing ground being made, but the questions, the students are still there. The students still have their same needs, whether it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago, and those students will still be there in 20 years' time. So I see a great role for the LENs moving forward into the new iteration of applied learning in Victoria. And hope to be part of that. For those who know me, I'm a big LEN fan as well, being the chair of the Outer Eastern LEN and the chair of the Combined Chair Council. So we're really looking forward to, at so many levels, to work together. I need to go to my slides now. Thank you so much, Trent. There's Thanks, no other questions come through, but I
think it means that everyone agrees with me. I think that's what it means. So.
Absolutely. I think you are right. And I will no doubt catch up with you shortly. And if anybody has any questions or comments to Trent later on, yeah, please just email us and we'll get that through to Trent and keep that conversation going.
Thanks so much.
Excellent. We will now move on to our second keynote, Applied Learning Rising to the Challenge for 2023 and Beyond, by Professor Damien Blake, who is Head of School for Deakin University School of Education and a Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Damien has extensive experience in program development across a range of education fields, including applied learning, initial teacher education, higher education, and professional and vocational education. Damien's research and teaching experience includes the use of applied learning and partnership-based approaches in schools, universities, and TAFE settings. He has recently completed 2 ARC-funded research projects, including one investigating innovative partnerships for youth engagement in education and work, which is exploring how partnership building pedagogies such as applied learning can improve educational outcomes for young people. Damien's most current work includes working in partnership with the Department of Education and Training to support the needs to increase the quality and supply of VCAL and VET specialist teachers in Victoria. I actually remember Damien from a keynote many years ago, which was at the Vala conference, which was called DNA, Developing New Assumptions, which was way back in 2012, and maybe even before that. And what really stood out for me, or the message, the light bulb thing that I got, was that Deakin was the first university that actually allowed pathways from the VCAL into a university degree. And I believe that was 3 children's services, doing a diploma of children's services, and then go into a Bachelor of Early Childhood Education. And I thought, and I really saw the pathways, and I thought, this is great, because what we hear often is that if you don't want to go to well, if you do VCAL, you can't go to university. And unfortunately, so many schools haven't really picked up on that you can still go to university, and it's not like it doesn't shut the gate, it opens gates. So Damien, thank you for enlightening me so many years ago, and welcome to the conference. And I'll hand over to you right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helene. And you do take me back there to that conference, to a time when I was probably 10 kilos lighter, particularly before the pandemic at least. And I was looking at that picture there, which was pre-pandemic as well. So I've got to find a photo which is probably more realistic nowadays. But anyway, can I say thank you for the invitation? It really is a privilege to have the opportunity to speak to so many colleagues who do such amazing work and have done so for such a long period of time, particularly over the last 20 years. But before I continue, I will also acknowledge the First Nation peoples and the traditional custodians of the land on which we're learning, working and living, and pay my respects. And I'm talking from Warren Ponds in Geelong, which is the Wadawurrung people, are the traditional custodians of the land here, and I pay my respects to them and their elders past and present and emerging, and to any other Aboriginal colleagues who are present today. So I'm going to pick up on a couple of themes that Trent has raised, and thank you, Trent, for that amazing presentation. I think it has really set the scene nicely. We are at a critical juncture, I think, in terms of what we do in Victoria in particular, and it is important to look back so we can learn from our history and where the VCAL came from in particular, and then to look forward. But of course, the complication and what's significantly different now is the pandemic that we've just had, that has raised the stakes significantly for the work that we do. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about those, pick up on some themes that Trent has raised, and with a view to getting to that third point, which is rising to those challenges. And Trent's raised, the questions of those challenges, and I want to focus on that third point in particular. So, back to the 1990s, Trent, you reminded us of what was happening at that time. In the 1990s, I was a deputy principal in schools, and in the lead up to the late 1990s, we had seen quite a lot of students who people were starting to describe, teachers were starting to describe as staying on. That language was really common. Some of you who were in schools at that time might have remembered that's how we talked about young people who were staying on to year 12. But in the context of the lead up to that period, you remember that we had the recession that we had to have, apparently, according to Paul Keating. And we'd seen some significantly declining youth employment opportunities at the time. And there was a lot of awareness, and I think this is what came out in the Kirby Review, that schools in Victoria and other parts of the country as well had quite narrow curriculum offerings that were catering for those students who we described then as staying on. And that's a really important point there, to think about how we describe young people who eventually were going into the VCAL, because it was a shift in the way we started to see them at the time. Most importantly, at the time, we had this thing called dual recognition. Some people might remember that. Often, dual recognition was starting at a huge rate of knots in the 90s, in the 1990s, and led to what we now know as VET delivered in secondary schools in particular. So there's a continuity there. So, but as Trent said, the Kirby Review really did make the big difference, because by looking at what schools were doing to respond to those students who were so-called staying on, the innovation that was rising from the ground up was being recognised as something extraordinary, which led to the eventual development of the VCAL and the trial of it in 2002, and the subsequent statewide offering of it in 2003, and then the extraordinary growth in enrolments that has happened over that period of time ever since. So for me at the time, when I was teaching, I actually taught chemistry and maths at year 11 and 12 and year 10 and a range of other things, and also VCAL. as well. So I taught students from all walks of life who were interested in all sorts of different things. And, you know, one of the projects that I remember incredibly fondly was when we built this fish farm, actually, and the chemistry students were working together with the VCAL students who were doing vet in agricultural studies and a range of other things. And we'd built this fish farm with 2,000 trout in this farm. So it was very practical, and the synergy of what was happening between the VCE at the time and what was under the banner of VCAL was quite extraordinary and amazing to watch, because they could see how they could bring together the knowledge and the skills that they were learning across those different discipline areas and approaches to learning. One of the interesting things was when the power went out, the oxygenation thing that we had, you know, putting oxygen into the water, you know, meant that 2,000 fish in a pond actually were running out of oxygen very quickly, and we all had trout for dinner that night, of course. But you know, that led to another interesting development where the students then built a cooling tower, and so on. You know, things developed from there. So you know, the power of applied learning is extraordinary. And it doesn't just happen in the VCAL. I think that's a really important thing to note, that it happens in VCE too. And as a chemistry teacher, maths teacher, also taught physics and biology and a few other things, you know, we used a lot of applied learning. There is something different about the applied learning in the VCAL, though, that I want to drill into a little bit more and talk about, and the opportunities for us. And also to acknowledge the importance of the LEN, you know, in getting to where we are, and also emphasize, you know, that our LENs play an even more significant role, I think, you know, as we move to 2023 and beyond. So the thing that was happening probably by about 2004, 2005, and I finished my PhD in 2004, which was specifically looking at applied learning and the VCAL and how that actually changed young people's experience of learning when they went through the VCAL. And I'll weave some learnings from that through here as we go. But, you know, we were starting to understand even then that valuing applied learning and vocational learning equally as what students were doing in the VCE was an ongoing challenge. And that's something we are still grappling with. And I'll come back to talking about that challenge later on, but it's something that we need to pick up and seize the opportunity with the Firth Review at the moment to see how we rise to that challenge in particular. But we also learned back then that we needed to broaden and develop teachers' knowledges and skills to include a deep understanding of applied learning. We saw what was happening, you know, through innovation in our schools, and not just in our schools. I mean, schools were emerging as base camp in those days, and we saw that the base camp started to involve partnerships with our vet providers, our TAFEs, and we had a lot, Auspicid, we had a lot of schools actually starting to deliver vet themselves, so they became RTOs in their own right. And importantly, we started to see these amazing partnerships that Trent also was referring to with non-government organisations, community organisations, employers, and you know, broadening teachers' understanding of the sort of knowledge that you need to teach in that way, you know, is quite a significant challenge. And you'll note that when I talk about applied learning, I always use capital A, applied learning, because I think there is a difference between the way we conceptualize capital A applied learning and small a applied learning. When I talk about capital A applied learning, I'm talking about the sort of applied learning that young people connect their learning to, you know, the genuine opportunities for learning in context beyond the school gates, beyond the classroom, as Tom Bentley would say. And I think that's a useful way to differentiate, you know, other forms of good applied learning, which might be hands-on and contained perhaps within the classroom. And you can do lots of good applied learning in that context as well. But capital A applied learning is something that you can't do just in the classroom alone. And that's a feature that I think, you know, we have to be, you know, acutely aware of, that we cannot lose, you know, as we transition into what is this next stage. So we're also learning that the need for school industry partnerships and collaborations with vet providers and employers and community organisations was critical. And that comes back to the sorts of knowledge that teachers have. You know, so it's not just knowledge about stuff that you teach. and I know that's a terrible simplification of it, but this is about building the partnerships and the connections to contextualize what people are learning, what young people are learning. And when you start to understand, how applied learning was being framed in those early days, and needing to be resourced differently, and needing to build networks and capacity with communities and with employers across our local communities in particular, you start to again see how the new skills that teachers need. It's not enough just for one or two universities doing pre-service teacher education to supply that. We actually need a systemic level of change that every teacher understands applied learning from that point of view. Importantly, though, as these challenges were arising, we're starting to see attempts to address those challenges that were happening. Probably one of the strongest and most difficult ones was this first one, though, the equal valuing of applied learning. And perhaps, not always the best advice has been given around applied learning. Despite good intentions, sometimes there are things called applied learning that perhaps weren't applied learning as well. But we've had what is a skill deficit and a knowledge deficit for some time. Most of the knowledge and the content that we have around this is probably in the virtual room where we are today at this very moment. And Vala's played an incredible role in building that and sustaining that. And I think now's the time to take it up a notch again. So applied learning has genuinely made a difference. I know that because I've through my experience working with young people in schools for 20 years, and then through the last 15 years or so in higher education and researching what's been happening, the stories that you tell are numerous. And most of you who are here today probably could contribute a story. I don't think we've ever captured fully just how important the difference is that it makes in the lives as young people. It's quite difficult to represent in more conventional ways in terms of numbers, but we know for sure, and I know for sure, that there are young people who have gone on to do amazing things. And as Helene was talking about before, many have gone through pathways that, when they're in school, people may not have anticipated that they will, but now some of them are teachers themselves. Some of them have gone on to become business leaders. Some of them have gone on to do amazing things. Some of them have gone on to do PhDs, I know too. But the thing here, it's done that by engaging and helping retain our students. And, how does applied learning work to do that? Simply put, I remember teaching a student, this mini case study gives you an example. By year 10, he was a larger, tall kid, quite threatening. If he wasn't physically threatening, but because he was bigger than the others, I think people felt, a little bit threatened, but he was a really gentle kid. He was pursuing a path along horticulture, and we'd been building horticulture certificates within the applied learning pathways as well. But in the context of schools, he was often talked about, as being non-academic, and not a good learner, too immature for school. The irony was, and still is today, that many of our young people who are conceived as too immature from school, benefit from adult learning principles. Isn't that amazing? That if you actually treat them like young adults that they are, and use a pedagogy that responds to them as young adults, and adult learning principles, which is what applied learning is heavily based on, then they respond differently. That young person went on to complete his certificate too. He's now a well-known greenkeeper in Victoria, highly celebrated. I won't mention his name, but I'm telling you the story that he went through was probably not the perfect story in terms of his own experience of good learning. The thing that disrupted his own view of himself as a learner was the fact that he was able to learn in a workplace context. And then by learning in the workplace context, like many of our VCAL students, he actually was able to hear people talking about the sort of valued knowledge and the valued learning approaches, and the fact that what was learning was not just academic. So in the school context, he was often talked about as being non-academic. In the workplace context, he was learning stuff that was not just academic. The importance of that workplace enabled him to change his identity as a learner. and through my own research, and I know from colleagues as well, that has been an ongoing story as a part of the value in building resilience in young people who haven't had such a good experience of schools and don't see themselves as academic learners, and then they develop these really solid understandings of themselves. They actually change their identity as learners in that sense. And applied learning, capital A applied learning, is the vehicle for that. So the making a difference is something to remember. It's a huge difference that has been made since 2002 and beyond. So where are we at and where are we heading? Well, what an incredible journey it's been throughout that time. We've seen the VCAL in particular, and I've just picked from the age alone a couple of headings. We've seen, it represented in a multitude of different ways. There's the classic and ever consistent one that young people are often understood as the dumb ones, or they think we're dumb, or they don't vote. That unfortunately still endures. And I think it's one of the things that John Firth said, well, enough's enough. Let's do something differently. Let's take on the challenge to change the conception there. And a lot of that founding work that, we need to disrupt some of the deep narratives. It's not a question about the value of applied learning. What it is a point about restating the context in which applied learning is happening. And that's where we need to start to rise to the challenge. And this notion of place-based that is often talked about, and John Firth talks about it in that review, that's something we've all got to get a lot better at, and understanding what that means. And again, that puts our lens as quite central in playing that role to disrupt this enduring narrative. So, I've been in situations where, I've been a judge for university initiatives, business initiatives and things like that, where students from across the country come together. And, as a judge, I've been asked to, decide on which particular group of students, which team have won, the business challenge. And over the years, what I've consistently seen, students in Business 101 or students in a particular accounting degree from such and such a university all coming together to compete, and a group of students doing the VCAL in the same competition, and for me, it was always quite ironic to see that the learning that they were doing in running their own businesses, for example, were winning awards. And if you track back through the awards, the VCAL awards that VCA has supported over the years, it's a good reminder of the amazing work. But there are some enduring challenges that we need to take on, I think, and change. So where are we now and where are we headed? I'll just emphasize that point about the impact of the pandemic. It's the obvious thing, really, at the moment. It really impacted our young people and continues to impact our young people last year. We know currently there are widening gaps, significantly widening gaps. We know mental health continues to be a challenge and for our young people, and also a challenge for our teachers and people in our communities. We've seen significant disruption to workplaces and the local economy. And the point there being, in the VCAL, so much has relied on our local workplaces and relationships with them. But we're also starting to see some things turning around, which I'll talk about too. This last point is incredibly important. I did an analysis of the voice of 700 people along the Great Southwest Coast of Victoria for the Beyond the Bell project, and it's concerning that our young people might actually feel hopeless at some point, particularly when we're going through lockdown 4. How do we address that? How do we put meaning in their life? I think that's where we start to remember the value of applied learning. So it's starting to lead towards even being more significant than it was when we were coming out of the 1990s on the back of the Depression, the recession that we had to have, and leading into the initial offering of the VCAL. The intersection of all these things that are happening now are actually leading to, stressing the importance of getting applied learning right, for 2023 and beyond. And that's where the real challenge lies. And I would say it's even more important now than it was then. But there are lots of good things that have been coming out of the pandemic and continue to arise. And we've had a 17% interest in careers in teaching at Deakin alone. And I know there's a lot of people who are quite interested in that, and many people who have come from different careers who actually understand, you know, firsthand the value of learning in workplaces. And they're important people in our school workforces because they bring another perspective as well. People who have gone from school, university to school are also absolutely important, but we need the right mix as well. We need a greater sense of local place, you know, and that has been emerging throughout the pandemic as we've tried to struggle with local issues. I mean, over the last 2 years or year and a half, I've been involved in a lot of work with the department and with colleagues from other universities and the Institute of Teaching and many other organisations. And I can say, hand on heart, I have never seen a period in my professional life where people, you know, from different organisations and institutions have been willing to work together and collaborate to the extent that we have seen in the last couple of months and years. So that is a shift in the way we work together. I think that we need to make sure we maintain in our continued work with applied learning. You know, we've seen the power of digital learning, and I don't mean just learning from home because we have to. I'm talking about the real affordances of digital learning that allow us to accommodate much greater diversity across people's situations in their learning contexts and so on. And also we know now, you know, that the risk of disengagement is probably even higher than it ever was when you start to, you know, put all these things together. What is, you know, really significant as we move into implementing, you know, many of the findings from the Firth review is that we get it right, so we don't, you know, see a decline in young people's engagement in schooling. And again, what we do with applied learning, it may not be called the VCAL. You know, it may be in terms of being offered through VCE vocational, you know, the cornerstone is applied learning, and that's the thing that we need to protect in the process. I think the deep understanding of that, you know, and I need to stress, you know, what we're doing now and over the next 2 years, and VCAA are doing and leading a lot of this work, you know, it's more than just curriculum work. This importance of keeping capital A applied learning in the way we frame and prepare our teachers, I think has to be maintained, and that's the challenge for us. So I've just put a quick summary of those Firth review findings on a page just to keep it simple and for your enjoyment, as they say. But there's a couple that I wanted to highlight, you know, that I think if you haven't read the Firth review, and as Trent said earlier, it's not common for people to read full reviews and things like that, but here's a couple of the key findings. You know, the notion of excessive variability in the quality of VCAL, you know, I think the Firth review identified that, and it's been a consistent challenge for us since the early days. I think we need to acknowledge that. Not all of the things that we call applied learning are actually applied learning. And I think we need to call that out. But partly it's not because applied learning is not valuable, it's because we haven't been adequately resourcing and preparing our teachers and supporting their development. And with our new teachers, our pre-service teachers becoming teachers, we don't have enough of them that understand, you know, what good quality applied learning looks like and understands the VCAL. And when you are looking at the VCAL and so many people who are teaching it, and many probably in, again, the virtual room, many of them have had limited or no preparation, have had to do a lot of learning on the job, I think. And there's lots of support, you know, that's offered through Vala, but this sort of work requires a lot more resource, a lot more time, a lot more energy, and a lot more knowledge and skill about things, you know, relating to partnerships and employment situations and working with the lens and those sorts of things. So it's not just because teachers don't want to do good quality applied learning, or schools, it's because we need to better understand at a whole of systems level, you know, what good quality applied learning looks like when it's integrated, you know, into our senior school certificate. The challenge of poor public perception still continues, and again, that is so damaging to our young people. And you probably have all heard, you know, people say things about academic and non-academic and all those sorts of things. What happens is it puts the young person from, you know, they see themselves as being diminished. They see themselves, because they want to take a particular path in life, you know, if they're talked about as, you know, leaving school early, when actually they're leaving to go to something really quite positive, or because they learn really well with their hands. You know, by framing them in such negative ways, it actually damages them. And in the context of a pandemic, we cannot do that. You know, there's been enough challenge in the lives of young people already, I think. So we need to rise to the challenge here. But, you know, how do you change public perceptions of applied learning? Well, you know, I work in a higher education institution. We do so much applied learning. We need to remind people that applied learning underpins medicine. You know, you don't want doctors who've only learnt from a book. They learn hands-on. Our teachers, you know, learn through professional experience and structured workplace learning. Our engineers, you don't want to cross that bridge, you know, that an engineer who only learnt from the book. You know, I think we need to do it as a whole of community. And in particular, this is part of the challenge in relation to the place-based approach. We need to change the perceptions of what is applied learning, and in particular vet pathways of all of the members in our community. And that requires a significantly joined up approach to do that. And I think it's really important for the rural regional context in particular, because, you know, I think that's where some of our greatest challenges are. And there are parts where, you know, that's where we're seeing young people not complete year 12 or its equivalent at some of the highest rates, so that they're actually missing out on those opportunities. But when you start to map across the Firth Review findings, I think you start to see, you know, what is being said, you know, through John Firth's review findings is here is an opportunity to reset. We may not call it the VCAL anymore, you know, but the point is applied learning is now more important than ever. And we need to rise to change the perceptions and address some of these systemic issues that we have known have been there since 2002, 2003. And that's the challenge, not just for schools, it's the challenge for communities. So those recommendations that came out of the Firth Review, that will have the VC vocational certificate, partial completion, the Q&A process, I won't go through them all, but they do stress the things that are needing to be done, I think. And I think it's important that we all understand what those are. And I know schools have been incredibly busy for the last year and a bit, year and a half, because of responding to lockdowns and those sorts of things. But this work continues, and I think we've got the opportunity to really focus on it now as we lead up to 2023 and you know, support the work that VICA's doing in particular, but, you know, at the same time managing to protect the notion of a capital A applied learning in the process. So challenge one, here's some challenges which I'll wrap up with. We need to understand the combined risk of a major VCE-VCAL reform with the ongoing impact of COVID-19 on our young people's education and the life outcomes. And this is not something that will happen into the future, it's happening now. I mean, our schools are seeing this happen now, you know, what's happening with young people as a consequence of the pandemic and engaging, but education now needs to be more meaningful than ever. And again, one of the things that I learned from that recent piece of work with Beyond the Bell in the Great South Coast was that applied learning provides an opportunity to connect young people's education, you know, with what keeps them motivated and what keeps them connected to their communities. And that's not surprising when you think about it and look at all the good applied learning, the capital A applied learning, where we've used festivals, where we've used sport, where we've used all of those things that connect young people to their community. And what applied learning in the VCAL has done is allow that to happen in a way that actually changes their lives and keeps them connected and adds meaning to what they're learning. So challenge two, we need to maintain those fundamental pedagogical elements of applied learning for 2023 and beyond. And by that, I'm saying capital A applied learning, you know, and that means avoiding the risk of reducing it to little a, and sorry if people use little a, I'm just using it in my context, but reducing it to abstract knowledge acquisition. And if we only view that challenge, if we only view the challenge of integrating the best of the VCAL into our VCE as a curriculum task, then there's a good risk we will miss the point here. It's about protecting the pedagogy that applied learning is, and capital A pedagogy. So as we go through the process of feedback and working with the drafts over the next few months, I think it's important to remember this point. ask ourselves, does this represent capital A applied learning? We need to understand the potential for combined place-based and strength-based approaches. And again, that's where our lens come in. We need to shift this notion of you do applied learning because you have some sort of a deficit, to build up the notion of connections to employment skills, to work-related skills, all of the things that we know are valuable in our communities, and emphasize that on a whole of system level. And that might be a way to shift people's perceptions, negative perceptions. We need to keep investing in teachers' professional learning and initial teacher education. And I know the department is doing that, significantly now, but this isn't a challenge. This is a challenge that's going to be ongoing for us, because to maintain things the way they are, we need to change our systems and our systems thinking in that. Every teacher who teaches in our schools, our secondary schools, needs to understand what big A applied learning is. And I think, when we consider that all of our government schools, will be adopting what will be eventually a VCE vocational, with the integrated elements of the best of our VCAL into it, I think that's now more important than ever. So we need to probably even include the VIT, and Vala has an even more important role than ever, I think. And 5, we need to better coordinate our education training partnerships and arrangements with employers and community partners, alongside what could potentially be an extraordinary level of growth in applied learning in our schools. And I think when you consider that applied learning in higher education, and applied learning has always been a strong part of vocational education anyway, the growth in the higher ed and the vocational education sectors that are happening alongside all of this, with a potential growth in schools, means that employers might have a lot of people knocking at their doors. We need to see this through the employer's perspective if what we're doing is really successful. So that's an important piece of work, I think. And again, the lens play an important part of that. And challenge 6, we need to understand the importance for young people's voice to be heard. And at this point, we should stop and consider, well, to what extent is their voice being heard and integrated into the plans to change our senior schooling curriculum for 2023 and beyond, and how could we strengthen those opportunities? And young people's voice is important now more than ever, to give them that sense of empowerment, but also to listen to the fact that this is not just about curriculum work. This is about life-changing decisions. And, that leads to the point that John Firth has made. We need to see, the opportunity that's been afforded by the review, that we can disrupt, what has been somewhat of a deficit narrative for some time, I think. So that is a really important part, and it's an opportunity that the Firth Review is now providing to us, but the challenge is on a whole of system level. So perhaps reframe what the age had put up, VCAL being dumped, to actually something VCAL's, applied learning from the VCAL is now going to be bigger and more important than it ever was. And in that process, a deep thinking about what VET is doing, VET and the potential expansion of VET as a part of it is so important as well. And then the last point in the challenge is that we need to seriously understand we cannot afford to get this wrong, for the sake of our young people who've had enough of the pandemic, I have to say. And we've all had enough of it, to be honest. But for young people in particular, we can't afford to get this wrong. And if young people themselves have a bad experience out of this en masse across the state, then that's not good for the health of our communities at all. They are the future leaders, and they're the people who'll be looking after you in your retirement as well too. So think about it that way too. So this last point is really important. What the work that's happening now around the rethinking of the VCAL and the pathway to 2023, we can't afford to get it wrong. The challenge has been the pandemic, because it's been a significant distraction, but we need to turn our attention as schools, as communities, as lens, as employers, to the piece of work that's happening now to see, well, let's, really join up and make a difference here. So that's the end. I'm sorry I've gone over a few minutes, Helene, but thank you very much again for the invitation.
No, my pleasure, and the pleasure is the thanks is all going your way, from us to you as well. I really appreciate your time and your insight and the history behind it. And as you mentioned, I think that there's never been a time where people and stakeholders are so willing to collaborate on this. It's a very important piece of reform that's happening right now. There's a lot of passion and a lot of history and knowledge that people have that are all passionately coming to the forefront at the moment. And you're so right. We have to take this this opportunity to make the improvements, to change the narrative on applied learning, and to create a great system, on a model, not a system, a model, but keep the young person at heart. A lot of people are asking for your slides, and I've told them that they will be available. People, there's a lot of comments coming, fantastic perspective and much to think about. Thank you, Damien. We had Gamathy, who is mentioned that one of his VCAL students became a lawyer. And one question from Cheryl at Head Start asking, what is the current percentage of our university curriculum that actually looks at applied learning? And I have a lot of anecdotes on that, but maybe you can answer that before we go into our next session.
It's a good question, and I have to acknowledge the work La Trobe Uni have done in this space too. I mean, La Trobe have been strong supporters of applied learning, as have Deakin. Unfortunately, when you consider all of the work in preparation of teachers, I'm thinking of, it's predominantly been Deakin and probably La Trobe to a large extent. I mean, our students who are here today, our Master of Applied Learning and Teaching students, that's a very strong component. It's about applied learning and teaching. So that's a big chunk of the curriculum. But if you're considering not just teaching, how much applied learning is being done across the whole of higher education, there's not probably a university in the country that isn't trying to build up what is more commonly termed as work integrated learning, but that's all about applied learning. So there's even our Bachelors of Arts, there's strong energy to try to put more applied learning in our Bachelor of Arts. And why is that? For the same reasons as the VCAL. It's about building employability skills. It's about connecting people who are in higher education to their communities. So the country actually can't get enough of it, even though it might be called different things at the moment. And that's part of the work that we need to do to change people's perceptions, I think, just in the school context, because it's limited to there, unfortunately.
And Debbie just made a comment. VCE teachers and school leadership teams need to hear this, and that goes to the whole. It's a systemic and it's a whole system approach that we need to adopt. And I do feel that teachers, coordinators, and their supporters have been carrying this on their own, but we need to get everybody on board for this. Thanks again, Damien. I'll be looking forward to be on this journey with you as well and work closely together. For all our participants, you will get automatically bumped off this streaming and go into the landing page where you can then scroll down to the session that is about to start. So enjoy your time. I wish this was in person and we could all have coffee and chat and create world domination in applied learning or through applied learning. But yeah, enjoy your day and send us any feedback. We will send out a survey later on. Thank you.